He thought he could call her tomorrow. By the time tomorrow arrived, she was gone. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below. And if you believe that the people who love us deserve our time before it is too late, hit like and subscribe. Now, back to Adrian Sullivan. The phone vibrated once against the polished marble table. Then again. Then a third time. Adrian Sullivan glanced down for less than a second before returning his attention to the conversation unfolding around him. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse lounge, downtown Seattle glittered beneath a blanket of rain, thousands of white and amber lights reflecting across the wet streets below. The city looked peaceful from 40 stories up. Untouchable. Controlled. Predictable. Adrian preferred it that way. Control was the foundation of everything he had built. At 38 years old, he commanded an empire that stretched across multiple states, managed luxury properties worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and employed people who carried out his instructions without hesitation. Most men spent their lives trying to become powerful. Adrian had already arrived. Yet the one thing he could not seem to control anymore was the growing distance between himself and the woman whose name now glowed across his screen. Olivia calling. He stared at it for a moment. Across from him, Chloe Bennett laughed softly at something one of the guests had said. Her laughter blended with the gentle music drifting through the lounge. Crystal glasses caught the warm light. Expensive watches flashed beneath tailored sleeves. Everything around Adrian projected success. Everything looked perfect. The phone continued vibrating. Chloe noticed the screen and smiled. "Your wife again?" she asked casually. Adrian exhaled through his nose. "Probably." His thumb pressed the silence button. The vibration stopped. The room remained exactly the same. The conversations continued. Nobody noticed anything significant had happened. But somewhere across the city, Olivia lowered her phone slowly and stared at the dark screen. Rain tapped softly against her windshield. The parking lot around her was nearly empty. A flickering street lamp cast pale light across rows of parked cars. She looked tired. Not the kind of tired that came from a long day. The deeper kind. The kind a person carried for months without telling anyone. She checked the time. 9:17 p.m. Then she tried again. Back in the penthouse, Adrian's phone lit up once more. Olivia calling. For the briefest moment, something tightened in his chest. Not guilt exactly. More like annoyance mixed with obligation. He told himself he would call her later. He always told himself that. Later tonight. Tomorrow morning. This weekend. After the meeting. After the trip. After things slowed down. The problem was that things never slowed down. And the people who loved him had simply learned to wait. Adrian silenced the call again and slipped the phone into his jacket pocket. Out of sight. Out of mind. Across the city, Olivia stared through the rain-covered windshield toward the distant skyline. Somewhere among those thousands of lights was the man she had loved for nearly 15 years. The man she still loved. The man who did not answer. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened her contacts and selected his name one final time. The phone began to ring, and neither of them knew that this call would change everything. Sometimes the most expensive mistake a man can make takes less than 3 seconds. Adrian Sullivan's phone vibrated against the polished marble table as rain streaked down the massive windows of the penthouse overlooking downtown Seattle. The city glowed beneath the storm. Thousands of lights scattered across the darkness like stars trapped beneath glass. Inside the private lounge, everything radiated success. Crystal chandeliers cast warm golden light across imported stone floors. Soft piano music drifted through hidden speakers. Men in tailored suits discussed investments worth millions of dollars, while servers moved quietly between tables carrying sparkling water and expensive desserts. Adrian sat at the center of it all, exactly where people expected him to be. At 38 years old, he had built a reputation that stretched far beyond the Pacific Northwest. People respected him. Competitors feared him. Business magazines called him brilliant. Yet none of those titles appeared on the screen lighting up inside his jacket pocket. Only 2 simple words appeared there. Olivia calling. Adrian glanced down and immediately looked away. Across from him, Chloe Bennett noticed the brief flicker of light and smiled over the rim of her glass. "She's calling again?" she asked casually. Adrian exhaled. "Probably wants to talk." He pressed silence and slipped the phone back into his pocket. The vibration stopped. The conversation around him continued uninterrupted. A few people laughed. Someone ordered another round of drinks. Outside, rain continued falling against the city. Nothing seemed important about the moment. Nothing seemed unusual. Yet 42 miles away, Olivia Sullivan sat alone in her car beneath a flickering street lamp outside a small waterfront parking lot. Rain tapped softly against the windshield while the engine idled. The dashboard clock read 9:14 p.m. She stared at the screen of her phone as the call disconnected. Her reflection looked pale beneath the dim interior light. Tired eyes, tired smile, tired heart. For nearly 15 years, Olivia had been the one person who remained beside Adrian through every chapter of his life. Before the luxury penthouses, before the private jets, before the magazine covers. Back when they shared a 600-square-foot apartment with unreliable heat and furniture bought from thrift stores. She remembered nights when they survived on instant noodles and grocery store coffee because that was all they could afford. She remembered believing those difficult years would eventually lead to something better. In many ways, they had. Adrian had achieved everything he promised he would. The only thing he seemed to lose along the way was time. Time for dinners. Time for conversations. Time for the woman who still waited for him every night. Olivia looked at his contact photo and swallowed hard. She wasn't calling to argue. She wasn't calling to complain. She wasn't calling to demand anything. She simply wanted to hear his voice. Just once. The rain intensified outside. Back in Seattle, Adrian laughed politely at a joke he barely heard. His attention drifted toward the skyline beyond the glass. Somewhere out there was home. Somewhere out there was Olivia. He told himself he would call her tomorrow. Tomorrow felt safe. Tomorrow felt guaranteed. Tomorrow felt close enough to touch. His phone vibrated again. Olivia calling. Adrian stared at the screen for a second longer this time before pressing silence once more. Then he slipped the phone away and returned to the conversation. Across the dark state highway, Olivia slowly lowered her phone. A single tear rolled down her cheek as distant thunder echoed across the water. She closed her eyes for a moment and whispered something nobody would ever hear. Then she opened her contacts one last time and pressed call. The next morning, Adrian Sullivan woke to silence. Not the peaceful kind that follows a good night's sleep, but the strange, empty silence that feels wrong before a person even understands why. Pale gray light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse. The storm had passed during the night, leaving the city washed clean beneath a blanket of clouds. For a few seconds, he lay still, staring at the ceiling. Then he reached for his phone on the nightstand. 12 missed calls. For text messages. None of them seemed urgent at first glance. His eyes moved automatically through emails, business updates, and calendar notifications before stopping on a familiar name. Olivia. 3 missed calls. Adrian exhaled slowly and sat up. He rubbed a hand across his face. Part of him felt mildly guilty. The larger part felt irritated with himself for feeling guilty. Olivia had called before. She worried. She overthought things. She always wanted conversations at inconvenient times. At least that was the story Adrian had repeated to himself for years. He tapped her contact and listened to the ringing. 1 ring. 2 rings. 3. Voicemail. He ended the call without leaving a message. She was probably sleeping, or upset, or trying to make a point. He told himself they would talk later. After coffee, after meetings, after he handled a dozen other responsibilities that somehow always seemed more important. 40 minutes later, Adrian stepped into the private elevator wearing a charcoal suit that had been custom-tailored in New York. His schedule was packed. Investors, property acquisitions, a charity luncheon. Every hour accounted for. The elevator descended smoothly toward the lobby. His assistant, Rachel, was already waiting beside a black SUV. "Good morning," she said. "There is one thing I should mention." Adrian accepted a coffee and glanced at his tablet. "What is it?" Rachel hesitated. "Mrs. Sullivan's assistant called twice this morning." Adrian looked up. Olivia had employed a part-time assistant for several years to help organize community projects and charity events. What did she want? Rachel checked her phone. She said Olivia did not show up for a meeting this morning. Nobody can reach her. Adrian shrugged lightly. She probably took the day off. Rachel nodded, though something about her expression suggested she was unconvinced. The SUV pulled away from the curb and merged into downtown traffic. Adrian turned his attention to business reports. Numbers, contracts, forecasts, things that made sense, things he could solve. Yet somewhere in the back of his mind, a small discomfort lingered. Olivia never missed appointments. She never ignored people. She never disappeared without telling someone. By noon, 3 more calls had arrived. One from her assistant, one from a close friend, one from a local volunteer coordinator. Adrian sent each call to voicemail. Not because he was trying to avoid them, because he genuinely believed there was nothing to worry about. Olivia would turn up. She always did. At 2:30 in the afternoon, Rachel entered his office carrying a folder. Her expression had changed. The calm professionalism was gone. "Adrian," she said quietly, "I think there may be a problem." For the first time all day, something cold moved through his chest. Rachel placed a printed report on his desk. It contained only a few sentences. Olivia Sullivan had not returned home. Her phone was unreachable. Her vehicle had been found abandoned near the waterfront parking lot where she had last been seen the previous night. Adrian stared at the page. The room suddenly felt much larger, much quieter, and for the first time since ignoring those calls, he realized that tomorrow had already arrived. Adrian Sullivan stared at the report for a long moment without speaking. The words remained the same no matter how many times he read them. Olivia's vehicle had been found. Olivia herself had not. The bustling sounds of the office seemed to fade into the distance. Phones rang. Assistants moved through hallways. Meetings continued behind glass walls. Yet none of it felt real anymore. Rachel remained standing across from his desk, waiting for instructions. Normally, Adrian made decisions in seconds. That was one of the reasons people trusted him to lead. But now he simply sat there, staring at the page as a strange uneasiness settled over him. "Have they contacted the police?" he finally asked. Rachel nodded. "A missing persons report was filed this morning. They are still gathering information." Adrian stood and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Elliott Bay. The water stretched beneath a gray afternoon sky. Ferries crossed the harbor in slow, steady lines. Everything outside appeared ordinary. Too ordinary. Olivia was not reckless. She was not impulsive. She did not vanish without explanation. His phone vibrated again. This time it was Olivia's closest friend, Rebecca. Adrian answered immediately. "Have you heard from her?" Rebecca asked before he could speak. Her voice sounded strained. "No." Silence followed. "This is not like her, Adrian." He knew that. Everyone knew that. Olivia returned calls. She remembered birthdays. She showed up early. She sent thank you notes. She worried when other people were 10 minutes late. The idea of her disappearing without telling anyone felt impossible. After ending the call, Adrian instructed his driver to take him to the waterfront parking lot. The drive took 34 minutes. Rainwater still shimmered across the pavement from the previous night's storm. Yellow caution tape fluttered gently in the wind. A few investigators remained near the area where Olivia's car had been discovered. Adrian stepped out and looked around. The lot was nearly empty. A small coffee stand sat across the street. Seagulls circled overhead. It looked like the kind of place people passed every day without noticing. One investigator approached him. "Mr. Sullivan?" Adrian nodded. The investigator pointed toward a parking space near the far corner. "Her vehicle was found there this morning. Locked. Purse inside. Keys inside." Adrian followed the gesture. Something tightened inside his chest. Olivia never left her purse behind. She carried everything in that bag. Photos, notes, small reminders, pieces of her life. He walked slowly toward the empty parking space. The wind coming off the water felt colder than it should have. Then he noticed something. Near the curb sat a small silver object reflecting sunlight through a break in the clouds. Adrian bent down and picked it up. It was a charm from Olivia's bracelet. A tiny silver lighthouse. His breathing slowed. Years earlier, during a weekend trip to the Oregon coast, Olivia had bought that bracelet from a gift shop overlooking the ocean. She loved lighthouses because she believed they represented hope. She once told him that people needed reminders that someone would always guide them home. Adrian closed his hand around the charm. For the first time, the situation stopped feeling like a misunderstanding. For the first time, fear began replacing certainty. And somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice started asking a question he could no longer ignore. What if the call he silenced last night had been far more important than he ever imagined? Adrian did not return to his office that afternoon. For the first time in years, meetings were canceled without explanation. Calls went unanswered. Investors were told to wait. None of it seemed important anymore. The small silver lighthouse charm remained in his hand as he sat alone inside the back seat of the SUV parked near the waterfront. Rain clouds drifted slowly across the sky while waves rolled against the shore beyond the parking lot. Rachel sat in the front passenger seat, quietly reviewing information on her tablet. Every few minutes another update arrived. None of them brought answers. Olivia's credit cards had not been used. Her phone remained offline. No one had seen her since the previous evening. Adrian stared through the window, watching people walk along the harbor. Couples carried coffee cups. Families pushed strollers. Life continued normally around him. Yet something inside him felt increasingly unsettled. Then Rachel turned around. "There is something else," she said carefully. Adrian looked up. "What?" Rachel hesitated before handing him a digital file. This was found among Olivia's scheduled appointments. Adrian opened it. At first it appeared ordinary. A calendar reminder. Then he saw the location. Seattle Regional Medical Center. Multiple appointments over the past 6 months. His stomach tightened. Olivia rarely discussed her own health. She always focused on everyone else. Friends, family, volunteers, community projects. Never herself. Adrian immediately instructed the driver to take them to the hospital. The 20-minute drive felt longer than any business trip he had ever taken. Gray buildings passed outside the window while unanswered questions filled the silence. When they arrived, a hospital administrator greeted them privately. The woman appeared nervous. Not because of Adrian's reputation, but because she knew something he did not. They entered a small consultation room, painted in soft, neutral colors. The administrator opened a file and looked down. "Mr. Sullivan, your wife requested confidentiality regarding her medical information." Adrian felt his pulse quicken. "What kind of medical information?" The woman inhaled slowly. "Several months ago, Mrs. Sullivan was diagnosed with a serious illness. She chose to keep treatment private." The room became perfectly still. Adrian stared at her without speaking. The words seemed unable to settle into reality. Serious illness. Private treatment. Months. He replayed the past year in his mind. Business trips. Conferences. Charity galas. Late nights. Missed dinners. Countless moments when Olivia had smiled and said she was fine. Countless moments when he had accepted that answer without looking deeper. The administrator continued speaking, but her voice felt distant. Adrian's attention drifted toward a framed photograph hanging on the wall. A lighthouse standing against a stormy coastline. The same symbol Olivia loved. The same symbol now sitting in his pocket. Suddenly, he remembered a conversation from 8 months earlier. They had been sitting on the balcony of their home, watching the sunset. Olivia had asked him a simple question. "If one day everything changed, would you make time for me?" Adrian had laughed and promised there would always be time. At the time, he believed it. Now the memory felt like a knife made entirely of regret. When the meeting ended, Adrian remained seated long after everyone else left the room. The hallway outside buzzed with activity. Nurses moved between patients. Elevators opened and closed. Somewhere nearby, a phone began ringing. Adrian lowered his head and closed his eyes. For the first time since Olivia disappeared, he realized he had not been searching for answers. He had been searching for the version of reality where he had not ignored her call. And deep down, he was beginning to understand that version no longer existed. Adrian left the hospital just before sunset, but he did not go home. Home no longer felt like a place. It felt like a collection of unanswered questions waiting behind expensive walls. Instead, he instructed his driver to take him to the foundation office Olivia had operated for nearly 7 years. The building sat on a quiet street near downtown, far from the luxury towers and executive boardrooms that dominated his daily life. Olivia had always preferred places that felt human, places where people knew each other's names, places where nobody cared about status. When Adrian entered the office, the lights were still on. Several volunteers remained inside, sorting donations and organizing paperwork. Conversations stopped the moment they saw him, not because they feared him, but because they immediately understood why he was there. A woman in her 60s named Margaret approached slowly. She had worked beside Olivia since the foundation opened. "Have you found her?" she asked softly. Adrian shook his head. The disappointment in Margaret's eyes was impossible to miss. She led him toward Olivia's office. The room was exactly as she had left it. Family photographs sat neatly arranged on a bookshelf. Fresh flowers stood beside the window. A half-finished cup of tea rested on a coaster near her desk. Everything felt alive and abandoned at the same time. Adrian slowly sat in her chair. For years he had funded the foundation financially, but he had rarely visited. He always claimed he was too busy. Olivia never argued. She simply smiled and said she understood. Now that smile haunted him. Margaret placed a small notebook on the desk. She carried this everywhere. Adrian opened it carefully. Most of the pages contained meeting notes, volunteer schedules, and reminders. Then he noticed something different. A list written entirely in Olivia's handwriting. Places she wanted to visit. Books she wanted to read. People she wanted to help. Simple dreams. Ordinary dreams. Near the bottom of one page, a single sentence caught his attention. It was written months earlier. Spend more time with Adrian before it is too late. His chest tightened. He stared at the words for several seconds. Around him, the office had become completely silent. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The sentence was not angry. It was not bitter. That somehow made it worse. Olivia had not written about revenge. She had not complained. She had simply wanted time. The one thing Adrian always promised and rarely gave. As darkness settled outside, Margaret quietly handed him another item. A sealed envelope with his name written across the front. Adrian recognized Olivia's handwriting instantly. His fingers trembled slightly as he held it. When did she leave this? He asked. About 3 weeks ago, Margaret replied. She told me to give it to you only if she could not do it herself. The room seemed to tilt around him. 3 weeks ago, Olivia had already known something, planned something, prepared something. Adrian stared at the envelope, but could not bring himself to open it. Not yet, because somewhere deep inside, he already understood a painful truth. Every answer he was searching for had probably been sitting right in front of him for months. He had simply been too distracted to see it. Adrian remained alone in Olivia's office long after the volunteers had gone home. Outside, the city lights reflected against the dark windows while the building settled into silence. The envelope still rested in his hands. His name, written in Olivia's familiar handwriting, seemed heavier than any contract he had ever signed. For several minutes, he simply stared at it. Then, with careful fingers, he broke the seal. Inside was a folded letter and a photograph. The photograph showed the two of them standing on a windy beach nearly 12 years earlier. Olivia was laughing at something he had said. Her hair was blowing across her face. Adrian remembered that day instantly. They had driven 3 hours along the coast without a plan, stopping wherever they felt like stopping. They had eaten clam chowder from paper cups and watched the sunset from a wooden bench overlooking the ocean. Back then, they had almost nothing. Yet looking at the picture now, Adrian realized they had possessed something far more valuable than money. They had possessed each other's time. Slowly, he unfolded the letter. The first line immediately stole the air from his lungs. If you are reading this, it means I was not brave enough to give it to you myself. Adrian swallowed hard and continued. Olivia's words were gentle, exactly as she had always been. She wrote about memories instead of regrets. She wrote about road trips, rainy afternoons, old movies they used to watch together, and the tiny apartment where they first dreamed about the future. Not once did she accuse him of anything. Not once did she complain. Then the letter changed. I know you are busy, she wrote. I know the world asks a lot from you. But lately I have been wondering if there is still room for us somewhere inside that world. Adrian lowered the paper. The office suddenly felt too quiet, too small, too honest. He forced himself to keep reading. Olivia explained that she had been receiving treatment for months. She had hidden it because she did not want to become another burden in his already crowded life. She admitted there were days when she almost told him everything. Days when she sat across from him at dinner waiting for him to ask if she was truly okay. Days when she hoped he would notice how tired she had become. But those conversations never happened. Meeting schedules interrupted them. Phone calls interrupted them. Life interrupted them. Near the end of the letter, Adrian found a paragraph written only a few weeks earlier. I do not need grand gestures, Olivia wrote. I never did. I only wanted ordinary moments. Breakfast together. Walks by the water. One more conversation before bed. The things people always assume they will have tomorrow. Adrian closed his eyes. Tomorrow. The word echoed through his mind like a distant bell. He had built his entire life around tomorrow. Tomorrow he would call. Tomorrow he would make time. Tomorrow he would fix things. Tomorrow had become his favorite excuse. When he finally reached the last page, a small note had been written beneath her signature. If one day you cannot find me, look where we were happiest. Adrian stared at the sentence. Then he looked down at the photograph from the beach. For the first time since Olivia disappeared, he felt something beyond fear and regret. He felt a direction, a clue, and somewhere along the Oregon coast, hidden among years of forgotten memories, he suspected the next answer was waiting. The drive to the Oregon coast began before sunrise. Adrian had not slept. The photograph rested on the passenger seat beside him while miles of highway stretched ahead through mist-covered forests and rolling hills. Normally, he would have flown private, arrived in comfort, and delegated every detail to someone else. This time felt different. The long drive forced him to sit with thoughts he had spent years avoiding. Every mile carried another memory. Every exit sign seemed connected to some forgotten chapter of his life with Olivia. By late morning, the ocean finally appeared beyond the trees, gray and endless beneath a cloudy sky. Adrian slowed as he entered the small coastal town where the photograph had been taken more than a decade earlier. Very little had changed. The same bakery stood on the corner. The same bookstore overlooked the harbor. Even the old bench facing the water remained exactly where it had always been. For a moment, time seemed to collapse. He could almost see their younger selves walking along the sidewalk, laughing over nothing important. Back then, neither of them had imagined how complicated life would become. Adrian parked near the waterfront and stepped outside. The salty air felt cold against his face. He carried the photograph as he walked toward the beach. Waves rolled steadily onto the sand. Seagulls drifted overhead. The entire coastline felt suspended between memory and reality. He eventually reached the weathered wooden bench from the picture. Someone had placed fresh flowers beside it. Confused, Adrian approached. Tucked beneath the flowers was a folded note protected inside a clear plastic sleeve. His pulse quickened. He picked it up carefully. The handwriting was unmistakable. "Olivia, I knew you would come here eventually," the note began. Adrian sat down slowly. The ocean stretched endlessly before him as he continued reading. Olivia wrote that this place had always reminded her of what truly mattered. Not success, not recognition, not money, simply presence. Being there for the people you loved before time quietly slipped away. She described how she had visited the beach several times during the previous months whenever treatment became difficult. The sound of the waves brought her peace. The horizon reminded her that some things remained beautiful even during uncertain seasons. Then Adrian reached a sentence that made his hands tremble. "There is one more place you need to see." Below the message was an address written neatly at the bottom of the page. A small cottage nearly 30 miles farther down the coast. Adrian stared at it. He had never heard Olivia mention the location before. Yet somehow he already knew it mattered. Deeply, he folded the note and slipped it into his pocket. The wind moved across the beach, carrying the scent of salt water and rain. For the first time since her disappearance, he felt as though Olivia was leading him somewhere rather than leaving him behind. He stood and looked out across the ocean one final time. Then he returned to his car and entered the address into the navigation system. The route appeared on the screen. 32 miles south, 47 minutes away. Adrian started the engine. Somewhere at the end of that road, another piece of Olivia's story was waiting. The road narrowed as Adrian drove farther down the coastline. Dense evergreens lined one side, while the Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly along the other. The farther he traveled, the quieter the world became. Cell phone signals weakened. Traffic disappeared. Even the radio faded into static. For years, Adrian had lived surrounded by noise. Meetings, deadlines, notifications, demands. Now, for the first time in a long time, he was alone with his thoughts. 47 minutes later, the navigation system announced his arrival. Ahead stood a small white cottage overlooking a secluded section of the coast. Wild grass swayed in the wind around a wraparound porch. A weathered wooden fence bordered the property. The place looked simple, peaceful, entirely unlike the life Adrian had built. He stepped out of the car and stared at the cottage. Something about it felt familiar despite the fact that he had never seen it before. Then he noticed a mailbox near the driveway. Attached to the side was a small wooden plaque. The Lighthouse Cottage. His breath caught. Olivia's favorite symbol again. Slowly, he walked toward the front door. A silver key rested beneath a flower pot exactly where someone intended it to be found. Adrian unlocked the door and stepped inside. The cottage smelled faintly of cedar and sea air. Sunlight filtered through large windows facing the ocean. A knitted blanket rested on the couch. Books filled a nearby shelf. Fresh flowers sat in a glass vase on the dining table. Nothing about the place felt abandoned. It felt lived in, loved. On the coffee table sat a framed photograph of Olivia standing on the beach below the cottage. She was smiling directly at the camera. Not the polite smile she used for formal events. Her real smile. The one Adrian had not seen in years. He moved deeper into the cottage. Every room contained pieces of her life. Sketchbooks, journals, half-finished puzzles, local maps with handwritten notes. Evidence of a private world she had built without him. A world he never knew existed. Then he found the guest book resting on a desk near the window. Opening it carefully, he discovered dozens of entries written over several months. Olivia had visited often, sometimes for a weekend, sometimes for an entire week. The entries described sunrises over the ocean, long walks along the cliffs, quiet mornings with coffee and books. Yet one detail appeared repeatedly throughout the pages. Adrian's name. She wrote about him constantly. She wondered if he was eating properly during business trips. She hoped he was not working too hard. She remembered old jokes, old memories, old promises. Even here, surrounded by beauty, she had been thinking about him. Adrian sat heavily in the chair. The realization hurt more than any accusation could have. Olivia had never stopped loving him. She had simply learned to live around his absence. Then he noticed something tucked beneath the final journal entry. A small digital voice recorder. A handwritten label rested across the top. For Adrian. When you are finally ready to listen. The cottage suddenly felt very still. Outside, waves crashed gently against the shoreline below. Inside, Adrian stared at the recorder resting in his hands. Somewhere within that device waited words Olivia could no longer say in person. And for the first time since this journey began, he was not sure he had the courage to press play. Adrian sat motionless in the chair for several minutes before finally pressing the play button. At first, there was only the faint sound of ocean waves and wind moving across an open microphone. Then Olivia's voice filled the room. Soft, familiar, unmistakable. Adrian closed his eyes immediately. He had spent days searching for clues, but nothing prepared him for the sound of her voice. If you are listening to this, she began, then you finally found the cottage. A gentle laugh followed. The kind of laugh that always appeared when she tried to hide sadness behind optimism. I knew you would find it eventually. You were always good at solving difficult problems. Sometimes I just wished you would notice the simple ones too. Adrian lowered his head. The words landed harder than any accusation ever could. Olivia continued speaking calmly. She explained how she had discovered the cottage almost 2 years earlier during a volunteer trip along the coast. The moment she saw it, she felt peace. It became the one place where she could hear her own thoughts without interruptions. A place where she could remember who she was outside of appointments, responsibilities, and waiting. Do not misunderstand me, she said. I was never running away from you. I was trying to find myself again. Adrian stared at the recorder. The ocean beyond the windows seemed quieter now. Olivia described the long walks she took along the shoreline. The books she finished reading. The mornings she spent watching storms move across the water. Then her voice softened. I talked about you constantly while I was here. Adrian felt his chest tighten. The owner probably got tired of hearing your name. I told stories about when we first met. About the apartment with the broken heater. About the night we ate pancakes for dinner because we could not afford anything else. Those were some of the happiest days of my life. Adrian looked toward the photograph resting on the table. For years he had measured success through growth, profit, and expansion. Olivia had measured it through moments. She always had. The recording continued. I know life became complicated. I know you carried enormous pressure. I know people demanded pieces of you every day. I never blamed you for that. Her voice paused briefly. But sometimes I sat across from an empty chair and wondered whether you missed me as much as I missed you. Adrian swallowed hard. The chair across from him suddenly felt impossible to ignore. Then Olivia revealed something that made his heart stop. There is one final thing you need to know. The night I called you, I was not calling because I was afraid. I was calling because I finally had good news. Adrian's eyes opened instantly. Good news. The words echoed through the room. Olivia explained that her latest test results had shown unexpected improvement. Doctors were hopeful. Treatment was working better than anyone predicted. For the first time in months, she believed the future might be larger than she had dared imagine. I wanted to celebrate with you, she whispered. I wanted to hear your voice first." The recording ended in silence. Adrian remained frozen in the chair. Outside, waves continued breaking against the shore. Inside, one devastating realization settled into place. The call he ignored had not been a goodbye. It had been an invitation to begin again. Adrian replayed the recording 3 times before sunset. Each time, Olivia's voice revealed something he had missed the time before. A pause, a laugh, a trace of hope. By the third listening, he no longer heard a farewell message. He heard a woman who genuinely believed life was giving them another chance. That realization hurt more than anything else. The future she had imagined had included him. The future he had postponed had never arrived. As darkness settled over the coastline, Adrian began searching through every drawer, shelf, and notebook inside the cottage. Not because he was looking for secrets anymore. He was looking for Olivia. Every page seemed to contain another piece of her heart. Recipes she wanted to try. Places she hoped they could visit together. Small sketches of coastal lighthouses. Lists of books she thought Adrian would enjoy if he ever slowed down long enough to read them. Then, inside a wooden desk near the bedroom window, he found a large envelope marked with a date from only 4 days earlier. Inside were medical reports. Adrian sat down immediately. For several minutes, he carefully reviewed every page. Most of the terminology was difficult to understand, but one conclusion appeared repeatedly throughout the documents. Improvement, progress, positive response, hope. The specialists believed Olivia's condition was stabilizing. Additional treatment options were becoming available. One physician had even written a personal note congratulating her on her determination. Adrian lowered the papers slowly. His hands were trembling. All this time he had assumed the worst. He had convinced himself the story was moving toward an ending. Olivia had been moving toward a beginning. A sharp knock at the front door interrupted his thoughts. Startled, Adrian crossed the room and opened it. Standing outside was an elderly woman carrying a basket covered with a towel. The woman smiled politely. "You must be Adrian." He nodded. "I am Eleanor. I own the cottage next door." Adrian immediately noticed recognition in her eyes. She knew Olivia. "You knew my wife?" Eleanor's smile softened. "Very well." She stepped inside and placed the basket on the kitchen counter. Fresh bread filled the room with warmth. "She talked about you every time she visited." Adrian looked away. That sentence had become both comforting and painful. Eleanor continued. "She came here often during the last year. Sometimes she would sit on the porch for hours watching the ocean. Sometimes she would cry. Sometimes she would laugh. But she always believed you would eventually find your way back to each other." Adrian felt a lump form in his throat. Did she ever say where she was going? Eleanor became quiet. For several seconds, she seemed uncertain. Then she nodded slowly. "A few days ago, she mentioned one final appointment. She seemed excited. Happier than I had seen her in months." Adrian's heart began pounding. "What kind of appointment?" Eleanor reached into her coat pocket and removed a folded card. "She accidentally left this at my house." Adrian unfolded it carefully. It was an appointment confirmation from a medical center in Portland. The date was the same night she disappeared. Across the bottom, a handwritten note appeared in Olivia's familiar script. 3 simple words. "Call Adrian first." The cottage fell silent. Adrian stared at the note while the sound of distant waves drifted through the open window. For the first time since this journey began, he was no longer chasing memories. He was following the final path Olivia had taken. And somewhere in Portland, the next answer was waiting. Adrian left the cottage before dawn. The note from Olivia remained folded inside his jacket pocket while the appointment card rested on the passenger seat beside him. Rain drifted lightly across the windshield as he drove north toward Portland. The highway stretched ahead through forests and small towns still asleep beneath the early morning sky. For years Adrian had traveled constantly, but every trip had always been connected to business. Contracts, expansions, meetings. This journey felt different. Every mile carried emotional weight. Every exit sign felt connected to Olivia's final days. By late morning, he arrived at the medical center listed on the appointment card. The building stood quietly among trees on the edge of the city. Large windows reflected the gray sky above. Adrian entered through the front doors and approached the reception desk. A woman in her 50s greeted him politely. The moment he explained who he was, her expression changed. Recognition appeared immediately. "You are Adrian Sullivan," she said softly. Adrian nodded. "Did Olivia come here?" The woman hesitated before calling a supervisor. A few minutes later, he found himself seated inside a private office. Across from him sat Dr. Melissa Hart, one of the specialists who had worked with Olivia during the previous year. The doctor listened carefully as Adrian explained everything that had happened. When he finished, she folded her hands and looked down for several seconds. "Your wife spoke about you often," she finally said. Adrian lowered his eyes. He was hearing that sentence everywhere now. "She came here 3 nights ago," Dr. Hart continued. "Her appointment went extremely well. Better than expected." Adrian felt his heart tighten. "Then what happened?" Dr. Hart opened a file. "After her appointment, she left the building around 7 in the evening. She seemed happy. Very happy. She told several staff members she had exciting news to share with someone she loved." Adrian closed his eyes briefly. He already knew who that person was supposed to be. Dr. Hart slid a small envelope across the desk. "She left this with us as a precaution. She said if anyone came looking for her, especially you, we should give it to them." Adrian stared at the envelope. His name appeared across the front in Olivia's handwriting. For a moment, he could not move. Then he slowly opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The message was short, far shorter than the others. "If you are reading this, then you finally followed the trail. I knew you would. There is one last place I need you to go. Not to find me, to find yourself. Meet me where every promise began." Beneath the message was an address. Adrian immediately recognized it. The small church outside Seattle where they had exchanged vows 15 years earlier. The room became silent. Dr. Hart said nothing. She did not need to. Adrian folded the note carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. For the first time since this search began, he understood that Olivia had not left clues to make him suffer. She had left them to make him remember. And somewhere near Seattle, at the place where they first promised to choose each other above everything else, another piece of the truth was waiting. The church looked smaller than Adrian remembered. Nestled among towering cedar trees just outside Seattle, the white wooden building stood quietly beneath an overcast sky, untouched by the passing years. He parked near the gravel lot and remained inside the car for a moment, staring through the windshield. 15 years earlier, he had stood at those doors beside Olivia and promised to place their marriage above everything else. At the time, he had meant every word. Somewhere along the way, ambition had slowly taken the place of intention. The promises had remained. The attention had disappeared. Adrian stepped out and walked toward the entrance. The air smelled faintly of rain and pine. Inside, the sanctuary was empty. Sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, casting soft colors across the wooden pews. Everything felt frozen in time. The same altar, the same aisle, the same quiet atmosphere that had witnessed the beginning of their life together. Then he noticed an envelope resting on the front pew. His name was written across the front in Olivia's handwriting. Adrian picked it up carefully and sat down. For a long moment, he simply stared at it. Then he opened it. Inside was another letter and a small flash drive. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the paper. "If you made it here," Olivia wrote, "then you remembered where our story started. That matters more than you know." Adrian continued reading. Olivia explained that she had spent months thinking about what truly made a relationship strong. It was not wealth. It was not success. It was not grand gifts or impressive achievements. It was attention, presence, choosing each other repeatedly, even when life became difficult. "People assume love disappears all at once," she wrote. "But usually it fades in small moments. Missed dinners, delayed conversations, promises postponed until tomorrow. That is why I wanted you to take this journey. Not to punish you, to help you see what we lost before it was too late." Adrian lowered the letter. His eyes moved toward the flash drive resting in his palm. Nearby, an old television monitor sat in a corner of the church office. With the caretaker's permission, he connected the device and pressed play. The screen flickered to life. Olivia appeared immediately. She was sitting on a bench overlooking the ocean near the cottage. Wind moved gently through her hair while sunlight reflected across the water behind her. She smiled at the camera. "Hello, Adrian." The sound of her voice filled the room. "If you are watching this, then you finally slowed down long enough to listen." Her smile softened. "There is something important you need to know. I am not lost." Adrian froze. His heart began pounding. Olivia continued. "By the time you see this, I am staying at a recovery center outside Bainbridge Island. My doctors wanted me somewhere peaceful while treatment continues. I turned off my phone because I needed time to think. Time to heal. Time to see whether the man I married still existed beneath everything that came later. Adrian stared at the screen, unable to move. Then Olivia said the words that changed everything. I am alive, Adrian. But whether our marriage survives depends on what you choose next. The video ended. The church fell silent once again. Adrian remained seated in the same pew where he had once promised to love her through every season of life. For the first time since this journey began, the future was no longer a mystery. It was a choice. Adrian left the church with the flash drive still in his pocket and a feeling he had not experienced in years. Hope. It was fragile and uncertain, but it was real. The drive to Bainbridge Island felt entirely different from every mile that had come before it. For days he had been chasing clues through memories, letters, and unanswered questions. Now, for the first time, he knew where Olivia was. The only thing he did not know was whether she still wanted him in her life. A light rain fell as he boarded the ferry crossing Puget Sound. He stood alone near the railing, watching Seattle's skyline fade into the distance. The city where he had built his empire looked smaller from the water, less important. The buildings that once defined his identity now seemed strangely insignificant compared to a single conversation he desperately hoped to have. During the crossing, Adrian replayed every memory he could find. Not the major milestones, not the expensive vacations or public celebrations. The small moments. Olivia falling asleep on the couch while reading a novel. Olivia singing softly while making breakfast. Olivia reaching for his hand during long drives. The memories he once considered ordinary now felt priceless. By mid-afternoon, he arrived at the recovery center. The property overlooked the water from a forested hillside. Large windows faced the bay. Gardens surrounded the walking paths. Everything about the place felt peaceful, intentional. A receptionist greeted him warmly and asked him to wait. Adrian sat near a fireplace while nervous energy filled every part of him. Minutes felt like hours. Then a door opened at the far end of the room. Adrian stood immediately. Olivia stepped into view. For a moment, neither of them moved. She looked thinner than he remembered, but her eyes were bright, alive, stronger than he expected. They simply stared at each other across the room. Days of searching, months of distance, years of neglect. All of it seemed suspended in that silence. Adrian took a slow step forward. Then another. I found you, he said quietly. Olivia smiled sadly. You finally looked. The words were gentle, but they carried the weight of everything left unsaid. Adrian felt emotion rise into his throat. I am sorry. Olivia nodded. I know. There was no anger in her voice. No bitterness. Somehow that made the moment even harder. They sat together near a window overlooking the water. For the next hour, they talked more honestly than they had in years. Adrian listened, truly listened. He heard about the fear she carried during treatment, the loneliness, the disappointment, the hope she almost lost. Olivia listened too. She heard his regrets, his mistakes, his realization that success had quietly become an excuse for absence. When the conversation finally ended, neither of them had solved everything. Some wounds required time. Some trust required rebuilding. But as the sun began setting beyond the water, Olivia reached across the table and placed her hand over his. It was a small gesture, a simple gesture. Yet to Adrian, it felt like the first real beginning they had shared in a very long time. The following weeks unfolded differently than anything Adrian had experienced before. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, he stopped measuring his life through quarterly reports, acquisitions, and schedules packed months in advance. Instead, he measured it through afternoons spent walking beside Olivia along the waterfront trails surrounding the recovery center. Some days they talked for hours. Other days they sat quietly on a bench overlooking the water while ferries crossed the bay in the distance. The silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt honest. Olivia continued her treatment, and slowly her strength began returning. The changes were not dramatic. They arrived in small moments. A longer walk, a brighter smile, a laugh that lingered a little longer than before. Adrian noticed every detail because, for the first time in years, he was paying attention. Back in Seattle, people were surprised by his absence. Meetings were postponed. Invitations were declined. Several business partners questioned whether something had happened. Adrian gave the same answer every time. Something important finally happened. He never explained further. One afternoon, nearly a month after arriving at the recovery center, Olivia invited him to join her in a small garden overlooking the shoreline. The autumn air carried the scent of salt water and cedar trees. Golden leaves drifted across the pathways while sunlight reflected across the bay. Olivia sat beneath a wooden pergola covered in climbing roses. Adrian joined her quietly. She handed him a folded piece of paper. "What is this?" he asked. Olivia smiled. "Something I wrote during treatment." Adrian opened the page. At the top was a simple list. Not a list of regrets. Not a list of accomplishments. A list of things that mattered most. Family dinners. Morning coffee together. Weekend drives without destinations. Reading beside each other in silence. Watching sunsets. Calling someone back when they reached out. The list continued for nearly 2 pages. Adrian looked up. "These are the things you wanted?" Olivia nodded. "These are the things I always wanted." The realization settled heavily between them. None of the items required wealth. None required power. None required extraordinary effort. They only required presence. Adrian folded the paper carefully. "I spent years chasing things that were never on this list." Olivia reached for his hand. "I know." Her voice carried neither judgment nor anger. Only truth. The waves below continued rolling toward shore. Somewhere in the distance, a ferry horn echoed across the water. Adrian looked at the woman beside him and understood something he had missed for far too long. Success had given him influence. It had given him comfort. It had given him status. But the moments that truly defined a life had been sitting beside him all along. As the sun began sinking toward the horizon, painting the sky with shades of gold and amber, Olivia rested her head gently against his shoulder. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. The future remained uncertain. Healing still required time. Trust still required rebuilding. Yet for the first time in many years, they were moving in the same direction. And that simple fact felt more valuable than everything Adrian had spent a lifetime trying to build. As winter approached, Adrian and Olivia slowly returned to Seattle, but neither of them returned to the life they had left behind. The penthouse overlooking the city remained exactly as it had always been, yet it felt strangely different now. The silence that once separated them had disappeared. In its place came conversations that lasted late into the evening, shared meals without interruptions, and long walks through neighborhoods they had not visited together in years. One Saturday morning, Olivia stood by the kitchen window, watching light snowfall drift across the skyline. Adrian was making coffee when she noticed something unusual. His phone was ringing on the counter. The screen lit up repeatedly. Messages appeared. Emails arrived. Requests demanded attention. Yet for the first time she could remember, Adrian did not immediately reach for it. Instead, he carried 2 mugs to the table and sat down across from her. Olivia smiled. "You are ignoring your phone." Adrian looked at the device for a moment before sliding it farther away. "I spent too many years answering every call except the ones that mattered." The room became quiet. Not uncomfortable. Peaceful. Olivia wrapped both hands around her coffee mug and studied him carefully. The change was real. Not because he made promises. Not because he spoke beautiful words. Because his actions had finally begun matching what his heart claimed to value. Over the following months, Adrian made difficult decisions. He delegated responsibilities he once refused to share. He stepped away from projects that consumed every waking hour. He reduced commitments that added wealth but removed time. Many people questioned his choices. Some believed he had lost his ambition. Others assumed he was making a mistake. Adrian no longer cared. He had spent years building an empire. Now he was rebuilding a marriage. One afternoon, while organizing a storage closet, Olivia discovered an old cardboard box filled with photographs. Together they sat on the living room floor, turning through memories. There were pictures from road trips, birthdays, tiny apartments, family gatherings, and ordinary weekends. In almost every photograph, they were smiling. Not because life was easy, because they were together. Eventually, Olivia paused at one particular picture. It showed them sitting on a weathered bench overlooking the Oregon coast years earlier. The same coastline that had guided Adrian back to her. She handed him the photograph. "Do you remember this day?" Adrian nodded. "We had less than $200 in our bank account." Olivia laughed. "And somehow we thought we were rich." Adrian studied the image for several seconds. Then he looked up at her. "Maybe we were." Olivia's eyes softened. Outside, Snow continued falling gently beyond the windows. Inside, the city seemed very far away. The deadlines, the meetings, the endless pursuit of more. None of it mattered in that moment. What mattered was the woman sitting beside him. The woman whose voice he almost lost. The woman who had given him one final chance to remember what truly mattered before it became too late. And as they sat together surrounded by old photographs and quiet memories, Adrian understood that some people spend their entire lives searching for success, only to discover that the greatest treasure had been waiting beside them all along. Spring arrived slowly that year. Cherry blossoms lined the streets of Seattle. Ferries crossed the water beneath clear skies, and for the first time in a very long time, Adrian Sullivan no longer felt as though he was racing against his own life. Nearly a year had passed since the night everything changed. The empire still existed. The buildings remained. The investments continued generating wealth. Yet none of those things occupied the center of his world anymore. One Saturday morning, Adrian and Olivia drove to the coast before sunrise. They packed coffee in a thermos, stopped at a small bakery along the way, and reached the ocean just as the first light appeared above the horizon. The same coastline that had once carried clues now simply carried memories. They sat together on the old wooden bench overlooking the water while waves rolled toward shore below. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The silence felt comfortable, earned. Olivia leaned back and watched the sunlight spread across the ocean. Her health had improved steadily. There were still appointments, still challenges, still uncertainty, but there was also laughter, plans, possibility. Life had returned in ways neither of them expected. Adrian looked at her and smiled. "You know something?" Olivia turned toward him. "What?" Adrian stared out at the water before answering. "For years I thought success meant building something nobody could take away." Olivia listened quietly. "Now," she asked. Adrian reached for her hand. "Now I think success is knowing who matters before it is too late." Olivia smiled softly. The wind moved through her hair exactly the way it had in the photograph from years earlier. In that moment, Adrian understood the lesson hidden inside every letter, every note, every clue she had left behind. She had never wanted revenge. She had never wanted guilt. She wanted awareness. She wanted him to wake up before life forced him to. Later that afternoon, they visited the lighthouse overlooking the cliffs nearby. Tourists moved through the grounds taking photographs while children ran along the pathways. Adrian paused near the railing and looked toward the endless horizon. 1 year earlier, he would have checked emails, answered calls, planned the next deal. Today, his phone remained in his pocket. Unimportant. Forgotten. Exactly where it belonged. Olivia joined him at the railing. Together, they watched sunlight dance across the water. The future remained uncertain because every future is uncertain. But that truth no longer frightened him. It reminded him to pay attention, to answer when life called, to be present while the people he loved were still standing beside him. As the sun slowly disappeared beyond the Pacific, painting the sky in gold and amber, Adrian realized something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The most important call he ever received was not the one he answered. It was the one he almost missed. And from that day forward, whenever Olivia's name appeared on his screen, everything else could wait. Because some opportunities return, some mistakes can be repaired, but the people who love us deserve our attention while they are still here to receive it. And that day, Adrian Sullivan finally remembered what truly matters. Several years later, people often asked Adrian Sullivan what had caused the biggest change in his life. Some assumed it was a business failure. Others believed it was a personal crisis. A few thought it must have been a life-changing opportunity. Adrian never gave a long answer. He would simply smile and say that sometimes the most important lessons arrive disguised as ordinary moments. By then, much of his life looked different. The endless calendar that once controlled every hour had been replaced with boundaries he refused to break. Family dinners remained protected. Weekend trips remained sacred. Conversations were no longer postponed until tomorrow. Olivia remained at the center of those decisions. Her health continued improving, though both of them understood how precious time truly was. That understanding changed everything. One summer evening, they returned once again to the coastline that had become part of their story. The ocean stretched endlessly beneath a sky painted with shades of orange and gold. Waves rolled gently toward shore while seabirds drifted overhead. They walked slowly along the beach, leaving footprints in the wet sand behind them. Neither felt the need to rush. For years, Adrian had believed life was something to conquer. Now he understood it was something to experience. They eventually reached the old bench overlooking the water. The same bench that had appeared in photographs, letters, and memories. Olivia sat first. Adrian joined her a moment later. Together they watched the sun descend toward the horizon. "Do you ever think about that night?" Olivia asked softly. Adrian knew exactly which night she meant. The night of the unanswered calls. The night that almost became a permanent ending. He nodded. "Every day." Olivia looked toward the water. "Do you regret it?" Adrian remained quiet for several seconds. Then he answered honestly. "I regret who I was before it happened. But I am grateful for what it taught me." Olivia smiled. The answer seemed to satisfy her. Around them, the world continued moving forward. Families laughed farther down the beach. Children chased waves. Couples walked hand in hand along the shoreline. Ordinary moments. The kind Adrian once overlooked. The kind he now treasured. As the final sunlight disappeared beyond the Pacific, he reached into his pocket and removed the small silver lighthouse charm he had found near the waterfront parking lot so long ago. He carried it everywhere now, not as a reminder of guilt, as a reminder of awareness. A reminder that the people who love us rarely ask for perfection. They ask for presence. They ask to be seen. They ask to know that they matter before it is too late. Adrian closed his hand around the charm and looked at Olivia sitting beside him. She smiled back. The room for regret had finally been replaced by gratitude. The fear of losing everything had taught him how to value what he already had. And as the evening sky darkened above the ocean, Adrian Sullivan understood a truth that would remain with him forever. Success can build a fortune. Ambition can build an empire. But only attention can build a life worth sharing. And that day, the world quietly remembered what truly matters.